How could a society take such a stark difference from being secular in many ways, allied with the West, to being in probably one of the top 5 enemies of the West, and a lot more authoritarian, obviously not secular anymore?
Khomeini pretty much stepped in claiming to be the sole representative of God on earth. He imposed a new religious dictatorship. And my father said, after 37 years, I'm not going to hang on to power by soiling my hands with the blood of my own people. He voluntarily left the country.
If Iranians don't have a favorable view of the US, who else could intervene in Iran? To what extent could the West intervene?
They lie when they say it's America. Our enemy is right here. What superpower are you talking about? This regime is not able to even support the most basic needs of its citizenry.
Crown Prince, absolute pleasure to speak to you, sir.
Thank you so much for having me on your program.
Not at all. I think the circumstances now for us to chat after Trump's inauguration is perfect timing. But before we dig into the current state of things in the Middle East and globally as well, I want to start with a question that I think is most fascinating as I research the Iranian Revolution, and I've been following it for a long time, but I've gone really deep in the last few days in preparation for this interview. Is the perception, not even the perception, the reality in Iran pre-revolution in 1979 and the post-revolution Iran, it's like a completely different country. So can you maybe tell the audience about what Iran was, what it stood for prior to 1979 when your father and your grandfather were the rulers for over 5 decades?
You have to also understand, in the context of your question, the time and era where everything was happening and the kind of world where Iran at the time had to face. It was a Cold War going on between the East and the West. You had the Soviet Union on one end and the free Western world on the other. And pre-revolution, Iran was on track for prosperity, for progress. We have the steady growing economy. People's livelihood was becoming better and better every day as education was becoming more and more a factor that Iranians were able to study abroad, come back to their country, and start contributing to the betterment of our country. We had, parallel to that, also a phenomenon which took root into two extreme forces that were against that progress. One was emanating from the traditional clerics, including Khomeini, who was very much opposed to the kind of liberal reforms that my father was trying to bring into Iran, which included, of course, the emancipation of women and their participation in various levels of Iranian governance. This is something that was frowned upon by the conservative clergy on the one hand. And you also had the Marxist forces who were against Iran's alignment with the West, and they were basically always bringing about the argument of anti-imperialism or what have you. And the combination of this Marxist left and the Islamists led to what created the environment for revolution in Iran against the previous regime. As a result of it, of course, this regime took power, and from the very beginning, its entire raison d'etre was to export this ideology beyond Iran's border across the world, using Iran as a launching pad. In other words, it was not a regime dedicated for anything it claimed to be, to serve the nation's interest or the Iranian people's interest. To the contrary, it took Iranians hostage in the first place and used Iran's resources to be able to carry out that agenda. So the contrast that you see is between a country that was moving forward and then was propelled all of a sudden a few centuries back in a very medieval type of mindset. And part of it was perhaps because people, in a sort of naive way, did not think that so much harm could come as a result of a so-called religious government. By the time they realized what Khomeini was all about, it was too late. And then we can dwell more upon it as to the phenomenon that where Iran is today as opposed to where it was 45 years ago.
Yeah, I think this discussion will mainly focus on current events. Obviously, under Trump, there's a lot changing, but also, and of course, when it comes to Israel-Gaza war, but also where Iran will be in the next 5 to 10 years, in your opinion, or where it could be. But I think giving a brief overview of the history of Iran is going to be very important for the audience, because a lot of people have a certain perception of Iran as a country and the Iranian people, which are two separate things. Um, just going back to pre-1979, so Iran was an incredible country in many ways. Things were very positive back then. You could be critical of the way it was ruled, how strict the intelligence, or the Savak, I think it was called, was at the time. But from an economical and social perspective, completely different. So give us an idea of how it was. You got, women's rights were very different. The economy was doing really well. I've got some numbers here. You had national income was growing, grew 423 times. The military was the fifth strongest military at the time. Um, Women had a lot more rights than they do today. The literacy was also improving. So can you give us a better overview of people in the US to kind of imagine Iran back then?
Well, I think in general terms, as you just said, socially speaking, Iran was really a country that was beginning to benefit from the kind of modernization process that started at the time of my grandfather, but was further carried out at the time of my father in terms of prosperity and people's livelihood becoming better. It was not just about women; it was key, of course, but it was about the fact that we never had to face the kind of discrimination that this regime has created against different ethnicities or religious communities. Iran was a country where people of different faiths were living together in peace and in harmony. We didn't have issues between Muslims, whether they were Sunnis or Shiites or Christians or Baha'is or Zoroastrians or Jews or what have you. This was as a result of this regime that all of a sudden came in, imposed a singular religious ideology to the detriment of everyone else. And that started the whole process of discrimination and inequality as a result. In terms of political liberties, yes, it was not ideal. And again, I would like to stress the fact that during the Cold War, part of the problems we had was certain groups that were leftist or Marxist groups were pretty much carrying out Moscow's bid. They were not out there to exercise the liberty of expression. They were actually carrying out a certain agenda dictated by Moscow. And when you talk about Iran's sovereignty and integrity, we had to be able to navigate between how far is it that you allow participation, but to what extent are you actually allowing elements that are not doing it as a result of our national interests, but are doing somebody else's bidding, getting involved. And, Iran was not the only country facing that. Look, half of Europe during the Cold War, all the countries behind the Iron Curtain. If you ask them today, what role did Russia or the Soviet Union had in controlling every aspect of their lives when they were behind that curtain? They will understand the phenomenon then of some leftist groups who were actually not there to, let's say, advocate socialism, but was really a totally different idea of international communism and what have you. So as a result, there might be criticism against some aspects of the Iranian intelligence service and how it dealt with the problem. But I think retrospectively, even if you ask people who at the time were opposed to the regime and had to face that, what has been said about that entity has been grossly exaggerated in terms of the true narrative. And it's only retrospectively in analysis that people see a balance between how far was that criticism legitimate and how far was it exaggerated. Having said that, the vision that we have for Iran's future takes into account all the experience that we have had, good and bad, so that we avoid replicating the same mistakes in the future. But most importantly, I think the biggest guarantee for people in terms of secular democracy and all of their freedoms and their rights in the context of what they ought to have in the future, in contrast to what they have today, is ultimately the rule of law. And if we are able to establish that under a democratic system, that's where citizens of Iran, irrespective of of their sexual orientation or political ideology or whatever ethnicity or religious belief that they belong to would be guaranteed equal treatment under the law. I think that's the element that is fundamentally important and a prerequisite to a positive future. You cannot have a stable governance without a free economy, and you cannot have a free economy without a stable governance. The two goes hand in glove. And I think when you look at the problems that you have in Iran today, including the economic problem, it's because a lot of it ties to the nature of the regime itself. And it has nothing to do with the Iranian people, their aspirations, or for that matter, our natural resources, because Iran is a country that today should have been, if not the Japan of the Middle East, at least the next South Korea of the Middle East. Instead, we have become the North Korea of the Middle East. Speaking of Korea, Iran's GDP was twice that of South Korea in 1978. Today, Korea's GDP is 7 times that of Iran, a country that has oil resources, natural gas resources, a country that its government cannot even provide people the most basic needs in terms of energy, in terms of electricity, in terms of water. This is what's in contrast. So when you look at the future and what a different Iran could be, it all ties back to the nature of the regime in place and the fact that Iran, free of this regime, will regain not only all the potential that it did realize before the revolution, but hundreds of times even stronger, I think, in the future.
Yeah, and another thing that could be shocking to people listening, before the revolution in 79, Iran was not only growing faster than the superpowers back then. I think it was France, the US, and the UK. It was the economy was growing faster, but also Iran was allies with the West, with all 3 countries mentioned and more other European countries, including West Germany, and was even allied with Israel. Iran was the second country, I think it was second after Turkey, that recognized Israel's sovereignty as a state. So it just kind of gives the audience an idea of how far Iran has gone post-revolution versus the Iran that we had in pre-1979. So my question to you is maybe, how could a country change so drastically without digging into the details of the revolution yet, of what happened in Ali Khomeini taking power and his beliefs at the time? How could a society take such a stark difference from being secular in many ways, allied with the West, to being in probably one of the top 5 enemies of the West, and a lot more authoritarian and obviously not secular anymore?
The way the regime took hold had its initial grounding into religious doctrine, in the sense that the revolutionary fervor was pretty much agitated and led by Khomeini, who brought in a concept that was in fact quite contrary to the tenets of Shiite religion. He talked about the governance of God on earth, velayat faqih. He pretty much stepped in claiming to be the sole representative of God on earth, and that everything was almost like nationalizing the church and being the only so-called source of emulation, which if you look at the Shiite tradition, unlike Sunni Islam, in Shiite Islam, we do have a hierarchy similar to Catholicism, except for in Catholicism, you just have one pope. In the case of Shiism, you have various sources of emulation, marja' taqlid, as we say. And at the time, there were multiple numbers of higher clerics at the rank of Ayatollah, which is the highest that you can achieve. Khomeini, in fact, was a junior member of that cadre. All of a sudden, he propelled himself in a position, telling them, you no longer will have access to revenue to finance your own, disciples. I will control every aspect. And he imposed, if you will, a dictatorship, a new religious dictatorship. Coupled with that, elements who facilitated the stabilization of the regime created an entity outside of the traditional professional army in the name of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards. It was initially designed to protect the regime from any potential threat coming from the regular army. And as you may remember, the war between Iran and Iraq broke out fairly soon after the revolution. And in fact, the role of the IRGC at the time was to keep in check the military at the borders as they were engaged in war against the invading Iraqi forces, creating a buffer, if you will. And the whole strategy of the regime from the very beginning, and in fact, let's not forget that in 1982, when Iran had reclaimed most of the territories that were invaded by the Iraqi army, Saddam Hussein, and in fact, as a matter of a United Nations resolution, was willing to repay Iran for the war damages caused as a result of his aggression. Khomeini rejected that. He said, we have to keep on fighting and we will ultimately, conquer Jerusalem via Karbala. His whole idea, again, was the ideology of continuing the conflict well beyond what it was intended, because he knew that peace will be much more costly to him, because now he will have the army back in their barracks in Tehran and will have to face the music as to, okay, where we do now. So the regime, in a way, bought time. In the meantime, the IRGC became more and more involved in getting more control of the Iranian economy. It became, in fact, a ruling mafia in symbiosis with the supreme leader. And after Khomeini came Ali Khamenei. And since then, the IRGC has been the instrument to keep the regime in power by using maximum repression against our own citizens at home, while carrying a policy of aggression abroad via its proxies like Hezbollah or Hamas, and beyond even the Middle East, all the way to Latin America. The reason I'm saying this is because if you ask me why this regime has been able to stay in power, it's been mostly as a result of sheer intimidation and terror and suppression of its own citizenry. It had the means and the might to do it. However, in the course of 40 years, the regimes, if it had any legitimacy at all, predominantly on religious grounds, but also in terms of its claim to whatever it is that it was doing, became more and more atrophied to a point that is now completely delegitimized in the eye of the Iranian people. It's still holding on to power because of the fact that it still maintains an instrument of repression, but people are still revolting against it. There's an outside element that is needed that can equal the playing field for the Iranian people. And that's the discourse I have with the international community, particularly the free world. Or why is it that you expect a change of situation in Iran if you're still conducting a policy of appeasement vis-a-vis this regime, rather than helping the Iranian people overcome this regime by giving them more direct support? Look, I'm not going to go further than examples of successful regime changes in the world that put an end to unwanted regimes, whether it was in South Africa, whether it was during the end of the Cold War. None of those campaigns were successful without some level of tacit and direct support from the outside free world. I think the same scenarios apply to Iran, and we can dig into it more. I can explain more to you about that.
Exactly. I've got a lot of questions on how we could move forward from the current regime and what paths does Iran have. But just going back to your father as kind of probably the last question before going to today's Iran, what would you say, and there's a lot of people speculating or at least analyzing what the Shah could have done differently back then, but what would you say were his biggest mistakes to allow Ruhollah Khomeini to take power? You know, some examples was very close to the US, a lot of US interventionism, that were, at least that's how it was perceived. The Savak was very strict in the way they dealt with protests, in the way they dealt with anyone that was opposing the Shah at the time, exiling the Khomeini when he was initially planning to arrest him. So these were some of the examples of what the Shah might have done, what could have done differently. But I want to get your thoughts on what your father could have done to maybe have you in power today or have someone else in power today.
Well, let me say one thing in general, and that is that hindsight is 2020. When you look back at an era of what could have been done instead of something else, a lot of people forget that whatever the sentiment is now was not prevalent then. In other words, if people, and I've heard this criticism a lot, if the Shah knew what was going to happen, why didn't he stop it from happening? Why didn't he hold firm? Why didn't he crack down on these people? The very same student movement today the Gen Z of Iran, who remembers that and actually accuses the generation of their parents of what madness they went through and what put them in a situation to bring about this regime in the first place, because this is what they say today, are much more reproaching the fact that my father should have stood firm. They forget about the fact that people of their age in universities in Iran were calling for his head. And my father said, after 37 years, I'm not going to hang on to power by soiling my hands with the blood of my own people. He voluntarily left the country. He said, if this is what people really want, then so be it, and allow for the chips to fall where they may. And today, the reason that the popularity of my father or my grandfather is at its highest, multiple times more than the highest popularity they might have had at the time they were in Iran, is because of this very fact. The contrast that people make between people who cared about their nation, they were not mistake-free, but their intention was to serve the nation, as opposed to a regime that from the very first day did not even care about Iran. You know, he spoke about Khomeini being in exile. And by the way, there's an interesting anecdote about that. Khomeini was pretty much behind an insurrection that caused the death of several personnel of both civilian and the military during the early 60s. As a result, he was condemned to the death penalty, which was a capital punishment for provoking those kind of murders, if you will. In fact, one of the people who were a member of the Savak went to my father and said, look, what are we supposed to do? If we kill him, he will become a martyr. On the other hand, if the law is not implemented, then the law of the land has not been observed. They promoted Khomeini, who at the time was not an Ayatollah, to the rank of Ayatollah, because Ayatollahs then were immune to the capital punishment in Iran. And as a result of which Khomeini became an Ayatollah, was sent into exile to spare his life. The first thing he did when he came back was to execute the person who was responsible for him staying alive and not being executed, which is an interesting anecdote in of itself. But Khomeini, when he came back to Iran, when he was asked by a reporter, what is your sentiment about coming back to Iran after 15 years in exile? His answer was nothing. He had no feeling whatsoever. Today, when Iranians look at that, look at what was trying to get achieved for Iran, and look at what Khomeini did, they see it today, 40 years later. But at the time, at the moment, the reading on the streets was different. Perhaps we had to go through this experimentation to see where we are today. Back then, talking about religion was taboo. You couldn't even discuss it. Today, the biggest debates about secular democracy and separation of church from state happens in many of Iranian, religious schools. The debate is open now in society. Religion has been weakened to the maximum possible extent. Clerics in Iran realize that people are moving away from religion. In fact, they convert to other faiths. Mosques are empty. What is responsible for that phenomenon? Again, it's the regime itself. And in contrast today, this is a collective, experience that has been now collected by the Iranian nation. And when you talk about the Muslim world in general, I would say that Iran is way ahead of the pack in the sense that they understand the consequences of life under religious dictatorship. They understand the consequences where elements that are tied to a religious doctrine could take things in a different direction. Look, even in the case of Egypt, when the Arab Spring occurred and the Muslim Brotherhood was coming in the picture, what was the reaction back then in Egypt proper? These are sort of experiences that the Middle East in general, whether in the Sunni world or the Shiite world, had to experiment with. And look at what people look at the situation. In fact, the phenomenon of religion itself, if you look at what MBS is doing in Saudi Arabia, is very different than with the generation of his parents did. Same contrast exists in Iran today between the Gen Z of Iran today and the generation of 1978 or 1979. And I think this is part of the collective path that we had to go through for the past 40 years experimenting with this religion.
A lot of people expected a very different outcome to what we had after 1979. I think it's a big learning lesson there. And I remember in one of the interviews I was listening to, there was a journalist that said the day I realized that we messed up was the day I just saw all these dead bodies from all the executions, the people executed once Khomeini came into power. And I think that was a big turning point, but it was a bit too late. And Khomeini was very quick in making sure he's got control over the military, control of power in Iran. And we have today's Iran, which is very different to the Iran under your father. What's really shocking, though, is that the support, I looked at independent surveys, the support that you have in Iran is about 80%. In 2024, we got one institute that said your support is at 79.9. Another one highlighted that 80% of Iranians supported yourself and your father. But it seems all the protests post the revolution, especially the one a few years ago when that girl was beaten up by the police, and that I think it was September 2019 that those protests started.
You talked about Mahsa Amini and her
Yes,
murder.
exactly,
Yes.
exactly. It was one of the, for me, when I was watching those protests, I thought that the days of the regime have ended. I want to get your thoughts on what was your, how did you process these protests and the outcome of these protests or lack thereof? Can you tell me more about why Iranians are not able to bring change again in Iran after so many decades after the revolution? The economy have gotten a lot worse. Society is just not as, I'd say society is against the current regime more than they were against the Shah back in 1979. That's not looking at research. It's just my interpretation of what I've seen watching these last few interviews. So I want to get your thoughts on why do you think Iran is not able to bring an end to the existing regime?
I will not characterize this exactly with the wording that you just utilized. I will say that if you look at the frequency of movements in Iran, protest movement or rebellions in Iran, in the last decade alone, you had far more numbers of protests occurring against the regime than anything in the preceding 30 years, including the Mahsa uprising. Now, the manifestation of such uprising are to be expected more and more as we go ahead in time. And a lot of it is not due only to the complete rejection of the regime in terms of its political legitimacy, but also because of the economic factor, as you indicated. Today, the Iranian currency is at its lowest devaluation ever. $1 is exchanged at 195,000 tuman. That's almost 15,000 times more than what it was at the time of the revolution. Not to mention the poverty line, which is 60%, inflation at 40%, the fact that the most basic needs of society are not being provided. Businesses and schools have to be shut down because there's not enough power supply, electricity, or what have you. All of that in the circumstances of a continued campaign of repression. But the Iranian people are fighting. They are still resisting. They are still moving. And one factor that is critical is that today, and part of why I have such level of popularity among Iran is because we are finding ourselves back in the narrative of our sense of national identity. That's very important to understand. A sense of national identity is critical for Iranians. In fact, when Mahsa Amini was murdered, some people try to characterize it as an issue related to a particular ethnic group, meaning the fact that the Kurds of Iran, who of course have been also subject to a lot of maltreatment by this regime. But Mahsa's mother said Mahsa was a daughter of Iran. Let's not make this an ethnic issue. It's an Iranian issue. And that shows you that irrespective of what part of Iran you may be of, whether you are from Azerbaijan or from Kurdistan or from Khuzestan or from Baluchistan, today the Iranian people find themselves in this collective narrative of a sense of national identity. And that's very important to underline because that's, in fact, the answer to a regime that from the very beginning talked about ummat. Ummat means those pertaining to a particular faith. It had nothing to do with Iran as a territory, as a sovereign nation, as a nation state, if you will. That's important to underline. And if you look at the slogans today, if you look at how people react to this regime, they find themselves in that narrative. So the alternative that we represent is all that is about our national identity vis-a-vis a regime that always denied it to us. That's factor number one. Factor number two is the fact that the regime is becoming more and more weak as we speak. So there are elements of fragmentation that we're beginning to see. One phenomenon which is very important for our audience to detect is the fact that if until the last few years, the narrative of reform was still being considered as something to hope for in terms of bringing gradual change to the system from within, that narrative is now completely gone. We have elements who belong to that camp, if you will, yesteryear, who now want to join forces with the rest of us who from the very beginning were advocating a secular democratic alternative to this regime and are now, moving in this direction. Case in point, I will name the name this time because he has been very vocal about it. I'm talking about somebody who was a right-hand man to Ali Khamenei as the editor-in-chief of Kayhan newspaper, which is the equivalent of Pravda during the Soviet era, if you will, was actually quite pro-regime from the beginning, a revolutionary, who today says we have to work together with Reza Pahlavi, join hand with him, and usher in a transition to a democracy beyond this regime. These are the factors and phenomena that will indicate how the paradigm is shifting within Iran, not just within people who are in complete parallel world to the regime, but elements who belong to the regime who are now beginning to defect to our side. Now, the only missing ingredient, however, to answer your question, why is it that we have yet to see complete success, is two things. Number one is that the critical mass is not quite there yet. By the time we reach about 5% of society totally mobilized, and that's a matter of coordination at home, I think that's where you will see the shift completely occur. But there has to also be an element of external support. And that's why I've been advocating as an approach that it's not sufficient to simply have a policy of maximum pressure against the regime, meaning economic sanctions or what have you. But there has to be a parallel policy of maximum support to invigorate the people, to give them more means on a more equal field of be able to bring about change from within Iran against this regime.
But by who? Because about 80%, that's independent surveys, about 80% of Iranians also have an unfavorable view of the US. Now that contrasts what we saw in protests where protesters, I remember, did not want to step on the Israeli and American flags back then, which was pretty surprising to many. But surveys do show that most Iranians are not too happy about the US. Maybe it comes to sanctions, maybe the ideology back, the media in the country. But if Iranians, you might disagree with those numbers, but if Iranians don't have a favorable view of the US, who else could intervene in Iran? And to what extent could the West intervene? In what ways?
Well, what I hear is different than what you were just saying, because among slogans that have been chanted in Iran, I would say it in Farsi first and then translate it to English. Duroug migan Amrikas, dushman ma haminjas, which means they lie when they say it's America. Our enemy is right here. These are slogans people are chanting in Iran in protest against the regime. So whoever is trying to persuade the world that Iranians are actually anti-American, look, throughout the past 4 decades, more often than not, Iranians have shown their sympathy to the West and, as a matter of fact, to America. Let me give you a tacit example. When 9/11 happened, there were celebrations on the streets of many Arab countries, from Cairo to Riyadh to Beirut to other places. The only country where the same evening there were candlelight vigils in sympathy to the victims of 9/11 were Iranian people on the streets of Iran. The only country in the Middle East who did that. That should be a key indicator to you that 9/11 that happened years ago, already people were showing their sentiments towards America, let alone today. And the fact that, and I think perhaps I had something to do with it, by breaking the taboo and traveling to Israel a couple years ago and say that a different Iran has no war or quarrels against any country, whether it's the Israeli is or the Jews or our neighbors in the Persian Gulf, the Arab countries. And the fact that since then you've seen that in many demonstrations around the world, more often than not, you see that along Iranian national flag is the Israeli flag. And in fact, even in Iran, they're demonstrating that. This is all to show that the narrative that the Iranians are anti-Western, anti-Jewish, anti-this is absolutely false. That's the narrative that the regime wants the world to believe. But Iranians will be first to tell you that this is not at all true. In fact, the reason, and I'll tell you the reason, it's not just a blind affection. The reason they appreciate the free world, led by America as the greatest democracy on the planet, so to speak, is because of the values that we share with them, the values of human rights, of liberty that is incorporated in the American system and many of the Western democracies. That's the commonality of values that Iranians share with the free world. They are only kept away from this world because of this regime being that wall that divides us from the world. As opposed to a regime that its DNA, its ideology is absolutely opposite to this very value system. So let us not confuse the regime and its narrative and rhetoric of being anti-Western and anti-this, as opposed to its people who are to the very contrary of the regime are the total opposite of it. And I gave you a few tacit examples.
How would an intervention look like and by who?
Well, I wouldn't use the term intervention because that's not what we are asking for. And I understand that the current administration, at least let's be very, very, very clear about it, doesn't want to get entangled in any kind of involvement as they had witnessed previously in the case of what happened in Afghanistan or later on what happened with Iraq and what have you. The scenario that I've been calling for all along has been a change that ultimately comes from within. It is based on a campaign of civil disobedience and basically work stoppages and labor strikes to paralyze the regime from within and forcing it to collapse. None of these scenarios require outside intervention, whether of a military kind or otherwise. In fact, it's in order to avoid that I'm proposing this scenario of change, which is something that is music to the ears of any foreign citizen, particularly if you're looking at America in this perspective under the Trump administration. They don't want to have boots on the ground over there. They don't want taxpayers' money to fund these kind of campaigns. I'm a taxpayer here. I don't want my money to be spent this way either. And I will tell you that in terms of what we require, in terms of boots on the ground, we have them already. It's the people of Iran on the streets of Iran fighting every day. They are the true boots on the ground. And number two, there's plenty of resources that could be used to fund this kind of campaign without using a single dollar or pound or euro of any foreign government. It's frozen assets of the Iranian people that could be repurposed to fund this kind of campaigns. It's a matter of, making it happen, finding the legal procedure to do that. Meaning that it's no longer yet again getting involved in some adventure in the Middle East. And I would particularly emphasize that unlike scenarios that were ill-prepared and were terribly, grossly mishandled, the worst case was perhaps what happened in Iraq after the fall of Saddam Hussein and de-Baathification. That we're talking about a process that is a controlled implosion, that there is something that will fill the gap post-regime collapse. We're not talking about vacuum. We're not talking about mayhem. We're talking about a controlled implosion. And that scenario is part of my overall strategy of how to bring in that element of transition. But we have to be able to work with critical governments that can help us in that process. And by helping us in the process, it's not just because it benefits us. It benefits them too in many ways. But most importantly, it will avoid scenarios where yet again they'll have to be dragged into some long-term unknown conflict in the region. And I can also explain more about this if necessary.
Just talking about what failed in 2019 and what could be done differently now. You talked about having some sort of foreign support. You gave an idea of having the money that's frozen, Iranian money that's frozen right now that could be used to fund those protests or those movements of civil disobedience. Is there anything more that the West could do to support the Iranian people and to challenge the regime from within. Because you can't, the West is even looking at a potential conflict with Israel, a US strike on Iranian nuclear facilities. So that seems pretty extreme. And that makes any other forms of intervention less extreme and more practical. I want to give you two examples that could be interesting for you to kind of think about. I was speaking to President Kagame about 2 weeks ago of Rwanda, and I was in Ukraine a week ago as well. And we saw what happened with the Ukraine mineral deal, and that being kind of a form of justification for U.S. intervention or further for U.S. Intervention in the country. And now the U.S. is looking at doing something similar in Congo when it comes to all the conflicts there and the minerals that are the source of all these conflicts, where the U.S. would offer security in the country. There's just discussions right now, offer security in the country in return for minerals of that country. Do you think there could be some sort of opposition movement that has a similar agreement with the U.S. to gain further U.S. assistance in succeeding with those civil disobedience movements? Because we've seen them fail time and time again.
Multiple aspects to your question. So to address the first thing, look, at the time of the Mahsa Amini revolt, let's remember what kind of government existed in Washington at the time. It was a government that has at the basis of its policy, in contrast to President Trump's first administration of maximum pressure, an approach of total appeasement, in the sense that not only pressure was removed from the regime, they in fact didn't impose the sanctions that had been called for, which were the oil sanctions on Iran, which led Iran to have access to almost $200 billion worth of money as a result of selling oil to China that they shouldn't have had in the first place, which serve the purpose of not only keeping it afloat financially to maintain its repressive machine at home, but to continue financing its proxies abroad. On top of it, they were paying ransom to free hostages. It was not a few weeks after the payment of that ransom that October 7th happened. Let's not forget about the fact that those elements of in fact reversing the pressure that could have made life much more difficult for the regime and ended up invigorating that, basically to a point that it's now the regime has learned a lesson that it pays them well to take hostages. Many governments in the West are succumbing to the same hostage blackmail, and there are some elements that I can give you that in fact sort of included myself in the process of being denied participation in some meetings as a result of pressure coming from those governments.
The Munich conference, correct?
Like the Munich conference or the appearance I was supposed to have at the Commission on Foreign Relations of the Dutch Parliament, again, as a result of their governments putting pressure because they were afraid that some hostages would be taken or God knows what else. But anyway, the point is that, as I was telling you earlier, it also depends what kind of conduct or adjustment of policy exists from the outside world looking at the Iranian situation. So that factor is something that we can discuss further, but this is an element to keep in mind as an element that could improve the chances for Iranians to succeed rather than being fighting this fight totally alone with no support whatsoever. That's number one.
Number one is like more, to summarize it, more of a Trump-like strategy versus a Biden-like strategy moving forward.
Well, yeah, look, appeasement has never been successful any time in the world. The last time it was experienced by Chamberlain led to the rise of Hitler and the Nazis, and we all know what happened next in the Second World War. The same situation applies to this regime. You cannot expect, and I tell you one thing in a more general sense, my biggest criticism of the foreign policy of Western governments, I'm talking about Europe, mostly, and to some extent the United States. It is the fact that from the very beginning, there was a misread on the nature of the regime. And most of their policy was based on an expectation of behavior change by the regime. Now, in some cases, you had the approach by the stick or by the carrot, but ultimately the whole premise was based on maybe we can make them more reasonable and come back to the negotiating table for whatever purposes of coexistence and what have you. Well, that premise was false to begin with, because it simply means that the world has yet to understand the true nature or DNA of this regime. Look, if in your DNA you're a wolf, you cannot transform into a sheep. A wolf is a wolf, and at the end of the day, it will remain as such. And if you look at it the way I'm proposing, all these years, We have seen a failure of diplomacy because it was still based on the same premise that I explained to you was flawed to begin with, as opposed to a reset of policy of saying, look, the problem lies in the regime itself. It is its nature that is causing all the problems you are facing, whether it's the nuclear threat, whether it's funding of terrorism and radicalism and proxy wars, interfering with maritime traffic by helping the Houthis, funding through their networks in Europe, the anti-Jewish rhetoric or anti-Semitism or threatening of activists or journalists or what have you. This is something that this regime has done. And so as long as this regime remains in Iran, it doesn't matter what policy of appeasement or negotiation you're trying to carry on, they will not change, because if the regime was to concede to any of these points, it's no longer going to be what it is. It will lose its very purpose of existence. The solution, therefore, is not to expect any change to be brought about by this regime. The best ultimate guarantee you have is to invest on the people of Iran. Let them prove to you that unlike this regime, they want to be part of the same world that is enjoying its freedom and its liberties. We are a country that once we have a national government that is concerned about the welfare of its own citizens, it will be the first to demand regional stability and peace, cooperation and peaceful coexistence with our neighbors that will put an end to all this antagonism. And it's in fact, at the end of the day, good for the world as well. Because it's not just about freedom and democracy, it's also about prosperity and economic opportunities. And in Iran remains one of the most important untapped areas, particularly when it comes to American business and companies, when they look at it, that they have been deprived of for the past 4 decades. Europe is facing many problems today. They are facing problems with immigration. They are facing problems with radicalism spreading within Europe, not to mention energy dependence that has always been a concern. A different Iran will be able to provide all of these answers in one shot, reversing the problem of further migration, but also bring about an element of stability that the whole world economy depends on. These are factors that are intertwined. But as long as there's not a reset of foreign policy, we're going to keep kicking the can down the road and expecting a different outcome by pursuing the same policy. To put it in one word, this is insanity according to Einstein. We have to do it in a different way now. And the opportunity is right in front of us, because you mentioned one point, and it's very true. Some people are contemplating that if there's no result of attempting to bring about a solution to the problem, we may be pursuing an avenue that would lead to confrontation or potential preliminary strikes or preemptive strikes on Iranian facilities and what have you. Again, I'm saying that we have now a window of opportunities where we can avoid all of these more dire scenarios by giving the Iranian people a chance to bring once and for all a final solution to the problem by eliminating this regime while there's still time. And I think we do have time, not forever, but this window is in front of us. It would be simply irresponsible not to give this process a chance before opting for more less desirable scenarios that you may be forced to implement. Let's try to avoid those more sinister scenarios by giving what is the most legitimate, the most least costly to a nation that wants change to begin with, but also the interests of the free world. We have to be able to see eye to eye on that. I've been able to persuade many diplomats, many politicians, many legislators here and there during my trips. And I think it boils down ultimately to a decision that depends on a strong, dedicated, decided leadership that makes change happen. And for that, I must say that President Trump may be doing his part. I don't think he can do it totally alone. I don't think he can put all the responsibility on the shoulders of the Israeli prime minister. The Europeans have to also play a part in this. But there has to be strong leadership, the same kind of leadership that put an end to the Second World War, when you had Roosevelt and Churchill, or during the end of the communist world, when you had Reagan and Thatcher. But today I want to know, what do we have in terms of strong leadership? emanating of a free world. So countries in the Middle East are not kept in sort of a guessing game as to where exactly are we going with this. If these issues are clarified, I think we have a fairly good chance of succeeding without having to contemplate more dire scenarios down the line.
What about the idea of a? It's going back to the idea of a Ukraine-like deal. Have you even had some such discussions recently? You're the face of the Iranian opposition, where you talk to leaders, say, we do want your support in some form. Not talking about boots on the ground, not talking about military strikes, but support to the protests, so they do succeed, unlike in 2019 and prior. And in return, we could do a deal similar to what Ukraine and the US are about to do, or what's being discussed in Congo.
Look, I don't think any of us, including myself, will ever claim that we have a mandate to decide on behalf of the Iranian people or for the people, because we're not mandated for that. I'm fighting for the liberation of my country. I think that a dedicated national government that will take into account Iran's national interest, but will be realistic enough to understand that it takes two to tango, will have the proper way of approaching how we can maintain our national interest at play by having the proper way of conducting business with the outside world. Let me give you some examples. Iranians are terribly upset about the fact that this regime has conceded too many points, let's say, over the Caspian Sea as a result of the weakness of our regime. Or now China is just leasing for long-term some islands in the Persian Gulf. These are sort of one-sided, unfair deals that obviously is an affront to our national interest. Having said that, of course, I think that an Iran that will be open for transparent, good, healthy economy and business will be able to find the appropriate solutions that will be win-win, both in terms of our national interest as well as the interest of a foreign country. But I'm not in a position right now to make any concessions, nor would I ever want to be in a position that I have had to, condition, have a string attached to our liberation by promising this or that to any foreign force. I will never do that. As a nationalist, I simply do not see myself ever committing to any such commitment. But I can say in a realistic way, look, an Iran that is free, an Iran that will have a government concerned and dedicated to our best interests will be hoping for, calling for your involvement. We need your technology. We need your investment. We need your entrepreneurs to be part of that picture. That's part of my Iran Reconstruction and Prosperity Project. I've been talking to a variety of entrepreneurs, of a representative of business leaders in America and elsewhere, that Iran needs a lot of that in order to restart our economy. Those kind of issues, of course, we can talk about. But this is very different than giving a concession over this or that in exchange for a liberation campaign.
Yes, I'm not usually an advocate of US intervention because historically it hasn't worked too well, but there are cases where it makes sense. An example is Congo. What's happening in Congo is heartbreaking, and if US intervention brings peace to the region, so be it, because it cannot get any worse than decades and decades of brutality and war, or even genocide. And Iran is less extreme, obviously, but is a good example because the alternative seems to be significantly more concerning, and that's a direct war between Iran and Israel, or Iran and the US, or both. And that's why I'm kind of pressing on that question. When I asked President Kagame the question, he was open to it. He's like, I'm open to such a deal, potentially doing a deal with the US that brings stability to Congo, and that led to the potential negotiations that are happening today. So that's why, Crown Prince, I've really pressed on that question, because I think it's not common that I advocate for potential intervention, not military intervention, but support in some way to the protests. But I worry the path Iran is heading right now, especially with the risk of a conflict. So that's why, again, seeing if you're open to such discussion, if that was on the table.
First of all, I think you have to look at Iran as its own scenario. You cannot compare Iran to Afghanistan or Iraq, or for that matter with Congo. I mean, we're talking about a completely different situation. And I think there's some element that we also have to look back at how Iran and what role Iran had pre-revolution, as we spoke about it a little bit at the beginning of our interview, that it was in fact an element of stability for the region. And it was an Iran that, even though we were still operating in the sphere of the Cold War, but even during that time, we had a very balanced foreign policy vis-a-vis the Chinese government, vis-a-vis the Soviet government. It was not only vis-a-vis the West. Having said that, Iran had cordial relations with our neighbors. I think a lot of Arab countries could attest to that fact. We had good relations with Pakistan. We had good relations with India. We had good relations with the Turks. We had good relations with Israel. I don't know if there was any country in the world at the time that Iran had any kind of negative or bad relations with. Everything changed since this regime came to power. Now, what are we talking about the prospect of a different Iran before we talk about the elements that you were suggesting? Look, let's say if we go along with my proposed strategy of having a policy from the outside world, that is, of continuing the policy of maximum pressure on the regime, adding to the equation the listing of the IRGC as a terrorist organization that is still not existing in Europe, but would be an important element to further curtail the regime's ability to do harm, but also parallel to this, bring that element of maximum support, in which case it will give the Iranian people a decent chance of succeeding. These two factors combined will lead us to a third element that I would like to also bring as a matter of consideration on the table, which is very important for the transition aspect. And that is, as a result of the first two elements, we can start expecting maximum defection. Why is that important? Maximum defection has two importance. One is domestic, one is international. Domestically, it means you reduce the element of resistance by the regime at the very end to attempt a genocidal type of repression, as Bashar Assad tried to do in Syria, and so on and so forth. That means that except for the very elements that have their hands soiled in the blood of the Iranian people that will have to account in a court of law in the future, the majority of these elements can survive regime change and have a future beyond this regime, meaning that they are not in no man's land, meaning that if you are a member of the core of the IRGC or military, and you are not directly responsible for those heinous crimes, there's no reason why you should not have a place in the future of Iran. And we make the contrast between what's important to happen in terms of our national reconciliation and amnesty. The process of truth and reconciliation in South Africa is an example. Transitional justice is key because there's not a family in Iran that hasn't been somehow affected by this regime, but we need to have a legal process that addresses that, and we have experts that are dwelling on the subject. All of this to say that we're trying to make the smoothest transition possible and the least costly to the nation, with an option at the end. So you don't have a failed state. You actually have an element that brings about immediate stability, but also provides for the country's restarting of its economy. So in that sense, it's of mutual benefit to anyone assisting us in that process, because a stable Iran, a free Iran, will be able to relieve all the concerns that will, A, force certain governments to take action in the case of the civilizational existential threat that Israel has against this regime and its nuclear menace, for instance, or for the U.S. to come and say, do we still have to be the world policeman and send our fleets to guard and protect and stabilize an area where Iran will be able to do that together with our friends in the region, mind you, together with the Israelis, together with the Saudis, together with the rest of the Persian Gulf countries, so they will not have to involve any foreign power to be there again and let us do that part of the job. This is the way I see the situation evolving. But all of this is hinging on the fact that the time is now, the regime is at its weakest, the Iranian people are more than ever ready for that change, they are calling for it, and all the world needs to do at this point is to give us that extra lift, if you will. Now, I've always said, by the way, to my fellow Iranians, that we cannot depend on any foreign government or countries for our liberation. We can only count on our own resolve. But it will be so much less costly to us if we did have the support, especially from the Western free world in that. And that's what the Iranian people are calling for. If you listen to what they are asking for, they said, we are not looking for your pity, but we want your partnership. We want you to consider us as your partners in the solution to the problem. We will do the job, but help us win over this evil regime, because in at the end of this regime, we will be faced with a nation that demands nothing better than happy coexistence and rejoining the community of free nations. This regime will not do it. So whether it's President Trump in the White House or any other foreign leader sitting in their respective capitals, thinking that there's any way to properly come to a compromise or a deal with this regime, you have another thing coming. It simply means you haven't learned your lesson yet. You haven't still understood that as long as this regime remains in place, you will continue having the same problem. And by the way, if you say that, okay, as long as it's not a direct threat to us, that's all we're interested in, then basically you're adding insult to injury to the Iranian people. It will be a slap in their face. So don't give us this rhetoric of being for democracy and human rights, because if you are really truly dedicated to that aspect, what example of violation of human rights exists on the planet today worse than you have in Iran proper? So where is your rhetoric in action? We don't need to have some kind of legislative statements by this or that parliament. We don't need to have symbolic acts of women parliamentarians in Europe cutting their hair in support of the Massa movement, because their government is still trying to cut deals with the regime, is still bowing to the regime's blackmail of hostage-taking, and they're turning their back on us. Look, Iranians are not stupid. They see what's happening. That's their expectation. So if you want to build a long-term relationship with a nation that will be grateful for that support, think of the long-term aspect, not only the short-term interest. And to be frankful, most of the reason why we've had this regime in place is because many governments have been simply kicking the can down the road and trying to pursue short-term interests at the expense of the status quo. And guess where we are today with the status quo? That needs to change, not just for the sake of Iran, but I think for the sake of the free world in the first place.
Have you spoken to Russian and Chinese leaders about this? Because I think their support of the current regime is playing a bigger role in them being able to sustain power than the lack of support to the protests or the citizens of Iran by the West.
I'd be very happy to talk to the Chinese and the Russians for that
Haven't
matter.
had a chance yet?
I haven't had the chance yet, and I think the circumstances should occur. And the reason I'm saying this is because they also need to understand that the change in Iran doesn't mean that all of a sudden Iran's vision is limited to only one direction. We have to have a 360-degree vision. We mean to be able to provide, as long as it's fair, a fair deal of what is commerce or trade with all these blocks. This is an interdependent world. I think we need to be able to show to the Russians and to the Chinese that the change in Iran doesn't necessarily threaten their interest, economic or otherwise. But if they expect us to bow down and accept unfair deals, that is not going to happen. Whether it's Russia, whether it's China, we are not going to accept any unreasonable, unfair deals. It's only a matter of our national interest. This regime has sold our country off. And the first thing I would do as a nationalist is to make sure that while we are not selling our country off, and if there are unfair deals that we have been imposed on by this regime, we will redress the situation and conduct fair, reasonable trade with whoever it is out there. We're not looking to have problems with any country in the world, so long as our national sovereignty is respected. That's all we are asking for. And I don't think that's an unfair expectation. They would have the same expectation too. So it's a two-way street.
I was speaking to Foreign Minister Lavrov yesterday, and we were talking about US-Russian relations over the next 5 to 10 years. I made a statement about 2 months ago now that I would not be surprised if there's an alliance. We're back to an alliance, not normalization of relationships, but an alliance between US and Russia over the next 5 to 10 years. Unpopular opinion, but things are changing really quickly. What do you think? It's starting to feel Iran is becoming, I know it's still a superpower, but it is becoming a bit of a pawn in this struggle between China, the US, and Russia. If we do see normalization of relations or an alliance between US and Russia, what would that mean for the current regime in Iran?
As far as Iran is concerned, they certainly are not happy at all about what happened recently. The complete dismantling of their proxies, the loss of a key regional ally in the form of the former regime in Syria, The fact that beyond their huffing and puffing, example, their campaign of retaliation against Israel that proved to be a dud at the end of the day, having spent billions of dollars in that campaign that could have otherwise served, helping the Iranian people who are starving and their salaries not being paid, or constant electrical outages and what have you. What superpower you're talking about? This regime is not able to even support the most basic needs of its citizenry. They're being placed as a pawn, of course. In that geostrategic game, the regime has served its purpose, including in the campaign against the Ukraine by Putin and getting, drones from Iran and what have you. But, I think the long-term vision, I try to imagine myself in the shoes of the leadership in China and Russia right now. I don't think anybody takes, in terms of long-term solution, any serious consideration of this regime, because I think as far as the Chinese footprint in Iran is concerned, even though they would like to have one, but it's been minimal. It could have been even more than it is right now. And the reason it's not at the level more than what it is right now is because I think that they also know that this regime is not viable and will not sustain itself for too long. So I think in that sense, the re-evaluation perhaps is certainly going through their minds. It is not unrelated to what the West is willing or prepared to do. Some of these discussions I'm not privy to. I can only speculate, and I don't like to speculate. I'd rather talk about facts than speculation. But to the extent that we can envision what could be happening right there, it might be a reset of what can happen in the region. But if you look at it this way, I mean, honestly, if we look at the last 50 years in general, the latter part of the 20th century leading into the beginning of the 21st century, there's no question that the world overall health and stability had been highly compromised, mostly as a result of what's happening in the Middle East, and solely as a result of the regime in Tehran to begin with. No matter how you look at it, the impact of this regime has been devastating in more than one aspect, not just to the region, but to the world in general. That includes the big powers. That includes the American bloc, the European bloc, and of course the Russians and the Chinese. So if you look at it in what could be the prospects of what would be different if Iran was to change, I honestly believe that we're not going to be in a zero-sum game between the old East and West conflict that we used to have. It's going to be quite different. And I think Iran can yet again prove that it is instrumental in bringing about the element that everybody was hoping for. When I went to Israel, I proposed that we should elevate the Abraham Accords to the Cyrus Accords. Why did I say that? Because I think that no matter how noble the attempt is with the Abraham Accords, and it is great, and it was only sabotaged by the regime. It was going on the right track, mind you. But without Iran, it will never bring it to the point of a complete resolution of all problems. It will not be an element that will ultimately make it possible to have viable peace. It will not be possible for the realization of an independent Palestinian state. It will not be conducive to anything that will allow for all these unfolding scenarios to occur. Everything is hinging upon a change in Iran. That's what makes my role relevant in this. That's what makes Iran relevant in this. And I'm not saying it only because I'm after my own country's interests. I say this because I also believe that it is in everybody else's interest, predominantly our immediate neighbors in the region, but also the world in general. So that's where we are right now. We are in a situation where we can address all these issues. While there's still time, I think the options are on the table. I think the options that I provide is the most reasonable, least costly, and most likely to succeed. And of course, there are other scenarios. But as I said earlier, it would be such a waste of historical opportunity not to utilize the options that we have right now on the table than what we could be facing down the line that would be perhaps more dire. And who knows what will be the outcome of those kind of campaigns. This is one that will be putting an end to a problem that threatens us all in one shot. And I think it's the most likely win-win scenario compared to other ones.
Crown Prince, you've been, as I listened to you in this interview about prior, you've been very pragmatic when you come up with solutions for the country. You've been very focused on Iran first, freedom focused as well. And something I noticed is that you're in a way averse to power in the way you've answered different questions and you positioned yourself. And you've got a pretty clear, logical plan for the country. Considering all this, would you? I know you said you would be happy to facilitate the move to a new government if we get to that stage. But would you agree to lead the country, considering how much support you have? If I was in your shoes, like it just seems like an obvious yes, but you've been hesitant to say it, and when previously asked. So not sure if you're kind of changing your mind and you becoming more vocal about yes, look, I'm going to be open and I'm happy to lead the country if the citizens vote. So
Again, I think that my commitment and my only ambition in life has been from day one to see to it that Iran is liberated, and instead of this regime, we have a proper secular democratic system in place. My only mission in life has been to usher in that new era and help facilitate that process. And I've accepted the responsibility of leading this transition. That doesn't mean that I'm running for office or that I have any personal ambitions down the line. And in fact, even if I did have that, which I don't, it would be putting the carriage before the horse. I really think that today, the biggest role that I can play for the nation is almost like the father figure. And in fact, today's generation, they mostly call me father. And I think that's the best title anybody could ever hope for or have. That's something that brings about the most interest for the nation. Governance can be done by others. I don't think that if we are able to succeed and make sure that Iran will have in the future the strengthening of its institutions, that will become far more system-centric than individual-centric. And this is really what ultimately maintains our country on the right path. If I have any role to play into bringing that into the fruition, I think that will be mission much more accomplished than anything else. And, at this point, let me be that father to help our nation survive. And let us focus on only the process that we are now facing right now and, not jump the gun into future solutions. I'm still committed to what I've said. Nothing has changed in my mind. But what I do realize today is that the amount of support, the amount of trust that people have in me puts me in a much more powerful position to be able to, in fact, be able to do that job for them because I have that support. And hopefully the world recognizes that this is what they're dealing with. This is not somebody claiming to be in a position, but the fact that there's that element to consider as who could bring this about for that country. And I stand ready to discuss this matter with whoever is willing to talk about this and find, the kind of solutions to the problem with the countries in the region and with the key governments, because I would like to be able to help my compatriots know that they are not alone in this struggle. And finally, the world is beginning to respond the way they should have a long time ago, but it's never too late. But today they can actually come and help the Iranian people liberate themselves and usher in a better era for all of us.
Crown Prince, the last point I want to focus on is something that's one of the more concerning issues we're facing in the Middle East, and that's a potential direct conflict between Israel and Iran. How close do you think the two countries are to an all-out war? I thought that was far-fetched just a couple of years ago, but then again, we had both countries strike each other's territory, which would have been unfathomable not long ago. But it seems now that Israel's kind of reconsidering it, the strike on Iran could be related to Trump's negotiations with Hamas and his stance on Iran, a more hawkish stance. Can I get your thoughts on where we are and the possibility of such a war?
Well, I mean, obviously, Israel will have to do what it has to do to protect itself. Having said that, I think that the leadership in Israel, perhaps more than any other government in the world, realizes exactly what I've been suggesting to you, how different the people of Iran are from the regime. If you look at the messaging of Prime Minister Netanyahu to the Iranian nation, talking directly to the people, something, in fact, I suggested he should do. And the way he talks about the fact that the regime is mostly afraid of its own people. That means that we understand that we want you to be successful to put an end to this regime so that Israel doesn't then have to step in and take measures to protect itself if there's a continuation of this system. So I think the narrative is not we're only considering striking Iran preemptively to protect ourselves. That's not what I hear from Jerusalem. What I would anticipate from Jerusalem, if what I'm proposing doesn't occur in the right amount of time, in this window of time between where do we reach that fail-safe point where you have to intervene by other means, that would be the deciding factor. So if we see more of what I'm proposing, that I think is in the direct interest of Israel, but also the free world, of helping the Iranian people overcome this regime, before it reaches the point of actually being a serious threat on its, and by the way, it's not just the nuclear threat, it's the all other aspect, but obviously the most evident element on the table is the nuclear threat. It's not just enrichment, it's not just about fabrication of a warhead, but the delivery mechanism and the missile system that could even reach Europe the way they are working on it. There are so many elements that are contingent upon how quickly do we move on not having to get to that point. Beyond that, it will be pure speculation. But in order to address it in a timeline that is sensitive, depending on the experts, it could be a matter of months, it could be a matter of a couple of years. It depends on how close or not they are into that. It depends what happens with the snapback policy of the sunset clause of the JCPOA and so on and so forth. There are so many other aspects that comes into play as to where can we situate the timeline. What I'm suggesting only, and at the end, is look, let's expedite the process of bringing maximum support so that change happens from within. So we wouldn't even have to consider what needs to be done because the regime will no longer be in place. As opposed to, as long as it's in place, all of these threats have to be taken into consideration, and we have to have contingencies for all of these scenarios. I hope that we opt for the solution that I'm proposing, so we don't even have to worry about what happens 6 months from now, a year from now.
So essentially what you're saying is that if change from within does not happen soon, we could, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but we could reach a stage where you would advocate for military intervention by Israel or the US to bring down the current regime, to weaken the current regime. And when I talk about military intervention, I'm talking about military installations, obviously nuclear reactors, and anything to weaken the IRGC.
Well, as a matter of principle, I've always been against any type of military intervention. How could I say that as a nationalist? Who wants his country being subject to any kind of foreign attack under whatever reason it is? But it is in fact because there is a solution to the problem of not having to face that situation. I cannot stop the government of Israel, or for that matter, the United States, or any government, to take some measures. I don't have power over them on this. What I can do is to press upon them the fact that there is a way to eliminate the problem altogether by making sure that the threat itself is no longer there. The threat is the regime itself. And at the risk of sounding repetitive, but the fact is, this regime is the root cause of the problem. Once this regime is gone, all the other threats that is related to the regime is gone. Any aspect of proliferation of nuclear technology and weaponry is also gone as a result of change of regime in Iran. We have the opportunity to bring about that change within the next few months because Iran is ready. It's not like, well, do we know if the Iranian people are ready for that change? Look, the Iranian people have been ready for years. The Iranian people are urging the world to say, why don't you invest on us for a change? You have wasted 44 years and counting of time trying to deal with this regime and negotiate with them. Why don't you come and help us put an end to this regime altogether. I don't think that anybody in his right mind, whether it's in Washington, D.C., or in Jerusalem, or in fact in the capital cities of our neighboring countries, would have any problem with that happening. They may not voice it as clearly as I'm voicing it now, but I guarantee you that's what they're thinking. They know ultimately the solution is for this regime to no longer be there. So we have an opportunity to make this happen. And the best way to avoid having to face scenarios of military intervention or preemptive strikes or what have you is by making sure that the head of the snake is finally cut off and we don't have to worry about the threat anymore. That's the best course that could be done in the next few months, as I think the opportunity is there. As I said time and again, this window is not going to be open forever, but we should take advantage of this situation, especially knowing that the people of Iran are more than ever ready for that change, and the regime in Iran is at its weakest point it has ever been. This is a perfect storm. This is the perfect opportunity to put an end to the problem. I hope that the right decision will be made by key governments to understand that we can give that element a choice, because our next choice would be, absent of a complete change of regime in Iran, then we'll be forced to intervene militarily or throw in the towel and accept a fait accompli of this regime being a reality in this world. I hope that's not the conclusions that they're reaching. So I do hope that they come along with me on this approach and help us solve the problem for all of us, to the best interests of the Iranian people, but also, I think, the best interests of the region and the free world.
Last question on this topic is comments made by your father about the Israeli lobby in the US. I want to get your thoughts on this because your father was allied with Israel, but he had a few critical points to make. I'll read out what he said. Again, that's referring to the Israeli lobby in the US. He said, they are strong. They are controlling many things: newspapers, media, banks, finances. And I'm going to stop there. And then he said, after asked again, not just the press. They are influential people. They have many means at their disposal. They are putting pressure on many, many people. Have you ever spoken about to your father about these statements or about Israel or the Israeli lobby? What do you think he meant by this, and where do you stand on? I know where you stand on Israel, but Israeli influence in other countries, which some people have been critical of.
Well, I never had an opportunity to discuss these matters at the time. But speaking of the time, 50 years later, and as a result of my own path and in recent meetings and the relationship I've had with the Jewish community, whether it's the Iranian Jewish community, the international Jewish community, the Israeli citizens, and the Israeli government, I think that the narrative and the perception and the views and what's our commonality of interest is to me very different than whatever might have been discussed or mentioned back in those days. I think today, when you look at how Iranians express their solidarity and sympathy, and vice versa, how many Israelis are responding to their Iranian counterpart, or for that matter, the Jewish community in the world. As I mentioned to you earlier, when you look at the fact that the Israeli flag is predominantly present in most Iranian demonstrations against the regime in Iran and abroad, I think the entire paradigm is certainly very different of what it might have been in the 70s and that era. So I think that the world is very different as we are today. Iran has changed a lot. The mindset in Iran itself has changed a lot. The sentiments on the streets of Iran back then might have been very different. That might have propelled some suggestions or ideas or perspectives. But from my prism and the way I look at Iran today and what's the reality on the grounds in Iran, it is very different that whatever might have been suggested back then. We're living in a different world right now.
Yeah, I remember when I covered the protests, I think it was a year or two ago now, and I had Iranians on stage, I think Iranians living in exile or coming on anonymously. Those living in Iran were very scared. They were protecting their identity, but others that were not based in Iran were, vocally supporting Israel, because they had a common enemy in their eyes. So the last question, Crown Prince, is if you were sitting with President Trump and President Putin separately, what would you say to them? Because I think they'll both play a pretty key role in what happens next in Iran. I know you said it comes from within Iran, but at least having some sort of support. Both countries are intervening in the country in one way or another. What would be your discussion with them like for both President Trump and President Putin?
One aspect where a leader of a government looks at countries, a lot has to do with how legitimate is the government or the representative of the government of that country as they talk to their counterparts relating to whatever issue there is. So my point is that what ought to be important for whether it is Vladimir Putin or Donald Trump is whether or not whoever is in Iran representing the Iranian side is in fact the legitimate representative of that country. Ali Khamenei certainly is not. Ali Khamenei today is being called the dictator that people are asking for his demise. The current regime in Iran is considered illegitimate by the majority of the Iranian people. And so whatever it is that you're assessing in terms of whether or not at the end of the day, this person represents the aspirations or the interest of the Iranian nation would be something for them to consider, as opposed to what I hope would be one day a regime that will have a true representation of our national interests, of the aspiration of the people, a legitimate government. And that is something that you can then count on, that you can build on, that you can depend on. And I think, again, part of the reason why the world has had problem in failing in its diplomacy is, number one, because they were counting on dealing with people who, first and foremost, are not legitimate to begin with, and they cannot even trust in terms of what it is that they're pursuing. They're not even pursuing the interest of their country. At least if they were pursuing the interest of their country in a diametrically opposed vision, that could have been an argument, but that's not even the case. So what I would be telling President Trump and President Putin is a different Iran is somebody that will be speaking to you from a point of view of what's in our national interest, but also in a pragmatic and realistic viewpoint. We cannot be isolationist in any form or shape. We cannot be blind that we have to be able to coexist in this world. And in many cases, there has to be some element of compromise and give and take, so long as you remain true to the core principles of whether or not it is ultimately in the best interest. President Trump believes that he had to move out of the JCPOA because he thought it was a bad deal as far as the interests of the American people were concerned, and so on and so forth. He has the MAGA movement. We want to make America great again. I say, well, we say make Iran great again. We have the same hope and ambitions for our country. But all of that starts by having, a legitimate governance. So, in order to get closer to that reality, I hope that it can look as to what will be ultimately in the better interest from either side, looking at Iran in general and the role that a different Iran could play. And that will be a start of a new era or a new chapter, if you will, as opposed to the current one, which is this regime and whatever it is that it represents at the end of the day.
We've got Make America Great Again, MAGA. We've got Make Europe Great Again, MEGA. And as of today, we've got Make Iran Great Again, MEGA by Crown Prince Pahlavi. Crown Prince, it's a pleasure to speak to you today. Really appreciate your time.
My pleasure. Hope to talk to you again soon.
Definitely. Have a good day.